Ladies and gentlemen, I stand here today. It is an honor to be here and speak to you all. I come to you as a true global citizen, a native of India. This is my ancestral home, since we're carrying on with the theme of homes. Actually, it was not coordinated. And until about 3 years ago, we didn't have electricity access, so zero carbon. And not to compete, once again, as an American national, who immigrated to the United States when I was about 8 years old, and one who has negotiated on behalf of small island nations at the UN climate negotiations. And after arriving here in this high northern place, somebody who is more sensitized to the fate of the Arctic. It is only when one has the opportunity to arrive to the edge of the world, or what somebody from where I come from, what this seems like the edge, but probably is not to the people who live here, one is able to make those connections. And while a presentation that is focused on a geography that is thousands of miles away may seem unusual at such a gathering, it has been said several times throughout this conference that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. And similarly, what 1.2 billion people in India do has an impact far and wide, including right here in the Arctic. And while India slowly but surely attempts to reignite its long-standing relationship with the Arctic that established by signing the Svalbard Treaty in 1920, perhaps the lessons of how India provides electricity to 400 million people without electricity access can foster cooperation. And cooperation not just between countries of the Global South, but between countries of the Global South and those of the North and the High North. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that we will be living in a high-energy planet for the decades to come. 1.6 billion people do not have access to electricity, and 2.6 billion people still burn biomass for cooking, the impacts of which will be felt here in the Arctic. For too long, the debate on climate change has neglected to envision what bringing these people who currently live in energy poverty out will, and provide them with genuine energy access for thriving and not simply surviving, will be like in a climate-constrained world. The markets and cultures may be diverse, but unpacking the factors is very important to study how diffusion and scaling of low-carbon technologies needs to take place in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And the truth is, under current scenarios, India cannot help the world achieve a 2-degree target that we heard about this morning in the fight against climate change. What you're seeing here to the left is a graph of one of the largest sort of energy planning exercises undertaken by the government of India, of the various different energy scenarios and the mixes that are being planned. And what you're seeing on the right is the impact in terms of carbon dioxide of these various scenarios. And the scenarios stretch from oil and coal heavy to the most renewable intensive. And a simple exercise of carbon budgets and what India would need to do in order to achieve a 2-degree target would place its emissions where you see that orange bar, and it is nearly half, less than half of what each one of those current scenarios presents. And the reason this is so is because India needs to expand its energy access. 400 million people, as I said, do not have access to electricity. 70% of the population burns biomass for cooking. And 40% of Himalayan glacier melt, this has an incredible localized impact, is happening as a result of black carbon emissions from the particulates. The 650 million Indians who were lucky to get electricity access in the last 3 decades are responsible for up to 25% of India's growth in carbon dioxide emissions. And we know that as 400 million more Indians are provided access, India is going to need to focus on this sector in order to continue to reduce poverty. So while India may not be able to handle a scenario of strictly allocated carbon budgets, what it can do is provide an understanding of how one rapidly deploys low-carbon technologies. And this is what I'm hoping to do through my work. And I've just returned from India, and it's been an exciting time studying the innovation in the energy access space. The map you see behind you is a foolish attempt to capture data from around the country, both through field visits and interviews, to study how this innovation is taking place. It's an annual market of $2 billion in the off-grid energy space. And while the government is still going to look at some centralized options for solutions to energy access, about 20,000 remote villages will have to rely solely on renewable energy and decentralized energy systems. So the lessons are incredibly important. And some of what I've been doing is studying how effective the government has been in diffusing diffusing off-grid solar technologies. The green dots are respondents of surveys of authorized solar retailers that chose to actually participate in my study. The rest either complained or yelled at me. But what I managed to extract was really interesting because it throws into question some of the data that we know exists about how much solar already is on the ground in India. And some of these figures already question what the IEA has put out there in terms of off-grid solar products being deployed in India. This is an underestimate and would blow some of the figures from the IEA out of proportion. And this is just a more formalized market. There are a large number of innovations happening across the country in the informal sector. People like this gentleman in the Sundarbans, which is the mangrove forest area in the border between India and Bangladesh, which will have some incredible impacts and will be closely tied to the Arctic, are picking out products and creating their own off-grid solar systems to power everything in their home, including satellite television. And he has access to the Real Housewives of Miami, probably, and doesn't know what he's watching, perhaps. But there are people that are figuring out innovative packages for selling solar technologies. And some of the things that I'm finding, and the reason I'd like to call them observations because they are observations at this point, I'm hoping to continue unpacking them, is that it is a business of leads. When we're talking about a decentralized market, everybody is a player. And the different key players that I'm meeting are pointing directions in middlemen and people who are taking a cut of the profits. But if that's what it takes to get solar on the ground and diffuse and play in this market, perhaps that's something that we need to look at as investors and innovators. There are complex networks at play in distribution of solar. If you know anything about Amway in the United States or innovative ways that companies are selling makeup where you make money off of selling products, it's also being translated into the world of solar, as is the example with this company, which has seen record profits in just the last 2 years in sales in the state of Bihar through their intricate network for diffusing solar. And once again, because it is an academic study, I'm looking at diffusion and the impact that word of mouth has on diffusion. So each bubble sort of represents an individual that told somebody else and influenced other people to make purchases in solar. And it's incredible to see how this plays out in rural India. Some questions that come up in this process is financing for whom? Do we have a false sense of how poor people save? Quite perhaps. Because I was finding innovative ways that people were managing to save and had the purchasing power to purchase solar products. And of course, the prices are also coming down. And the reasons for purchasing are also different. With low-cost appliances coming online, it's further diffusing the products. I'm getting the music here. And perhaps the most important thing is that people like this gentleman are getting simple training to create entire kits of off-grid solar lighting systems to be able to sell. And they're far outstripping some of the more well-known business plan competition-winning companies that we hear about. And perhaps it's time to look at how we can strengthen these networks of people we might not consider very educated, but who are fully capable and embedded in the ecosystems which are so important to sustain a product and a technology like this in the field. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that it's important to bridge the gap in dialogue and policy between climate change and energy access for a more secure environment in the Arctic. The solutions to address energy access will be centralized as well as decentralized, and some of those solutions include geothermal and microhydro. And understanding diffusion patterns for technology and the ecosystems in which they are deployed is critical to scaling up of low-carbon technologies. In my short time here, I have managed to venture out beyond the city and catch a glimpse of what rural Iceland looks like. Scattered homes, sometimes miles apart, small communities, lone lights amidst a sea of darkness at night. This is not unfamiliar scene to the part of India from which I come. The challenge there, however, is that decades of underdevelopment, missed opportunities, and playing politics with power. But as India awakens to a renewed mission of fulfilling this promise of power, it will serve as a testbed for humanity on how low-carbon technologies can be diffused for the base of the pyramid and remote communities around the world. As we are bound together in facing this challenge, we are also bound together in finding the solutions. Thank you.